It was a crisp, quiet morning in the small town of Milford, where nothing ever seemed to change. Marcus had been born and raised here, and like most of the people who lived in this close-knit community, he led a simple life. A mechanic by trade, he ran a modest auto repair shop just off Main Street. He wasn't wealthy, but he didn't need to be. His life was built around the small joys, morning coffee with his wife, Jana, and the satisfaction of fixing a car that had been running on fumes for far too long. The kind of satisfaction you get from a job well done, no matter how routine it seemed. That morning, like any other, started with the familiar hum of his old truck's engine as it roared to life. Marcus had woken up early, as he always did, to have breakfast with Jana before heading out to work. The kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes, Jana's signature morning dish. They exchanged soft greetings and words of encouragement, as they had for years, never knowing that today would be different. The clock ticked past 7:30 a.m., and Marcus kissed his wife goodbye, throwing on his jacket as he stepped out the door. As he made his way down the narrow road leading to his shop, the town seemed frozen in time. The usual morning hustle was already in full swing, kids heading off to school, delivery trucks making their rounds, and the local bakery filling the air with the scent of freshly baked bread. There was a sense of peace in Milford, a quietness that made it feel like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. Marcus liked it that way. He had never been the type to seek out attention. Over the years, people in Milford had come to respect him, not because he sought it, but because he did his job with integrity. He didn't belong to any local clubs or frequent the town's few watering holes. He kept to himself and lived a life that allowed him to avoid the chaos of the outside world. In fact, most people didn't even know the full extent of his past, his time in the military, his service overseas, and the battles he fought both on and off the field. It wasn't something he talked about. That was the past, and Marcus was about the present, fixing cars, helping neighbors, and living quietly with Jana. But as he pulled into the local gas station that morning to fill up his truck, something felt different. The world around him didn't seem quite as still as it had the day before. As he stepped out of his truck, he noticed a few unfamiliar faces standing by the pump, talking in low voices. They were dressed in police uniforms, but they weren't the usual officers he saw around town. Marcus didn't recognize them. They were young, laughing amongst themselves, clearly enjoying the break from their work. He shrugged it off and went to the pump to fill his gas tank. Just as he finished fueling up, one of the officers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, walked over. He had a smirk on his face, as if he were about to deliver a punchline to a joke Marcus wasn't in on. "Hey, you sure you're not up to something, buddy?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with mock suspicion. "You look a little out of place around here." Marcus blinked, taken aback by the officer's tone. He hadn't done anything wrong, he was just filling up his truck, but something about the officer's gaze felt cold, like he was being sized up in a way that wasn't friendly. "I'm just getting some gas," Marcus replied calmly, wiping his hands on his jeans as he finished. The officer glanced at his partner, a younger, more nervous-looking officer, who stepped forward. "You know, we've been getting some reports about suspicious activity in the area. We just gotta check everyone, right? No harm done." Marcus could feel the tension start to build, the unease creeping up on him. The officer wasn't joking anymore, and he wasn't being subtle about it. This wasn't just a casual conversation, it was an interrogation disguised as a check. Marcus tried to stay composed, reminding himself that he had learned to handle situations like this during his years in the military. He could keep calm. But the officers weren't letting up. The older officer, clearly the one in charge, walked around Marcus's truck, peering inside. "Let's see what you've got in here." "Just a quick search, nothing personal, just protocol," he said, though the smirk on his face suggested anything but protocol. Marcus's blood began to boil. He had been stopped before, many times, but never like this. Never by officers who looked at him like he was a criminal for no reason other than his appearance. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could respond, the younger officer spoke up, almost sheepishly. Maybe we should just let him go, you know? He seems all right." The older officer ignored him and continued his invasive search, looking under the seats and glancing over every detail of Marcus's truck with an air of superiority. Marcus felt his heart racing. The officer wasn't just probing for something illegal, he was enjoying the power of it. The idea that he could intimidate someone with impunity. Just as the older officer straightened up from inspecting the truck, Marcus made a split-second decision. He had had enough. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the recognition that if he let this go on, it wouldn't just be about his truck or a simple inconvenience. It would be about the kind of town Milford had become. He stood tall, his voice firm. "You don't know who I am, do you?" he asked. The officer blinked, clearly taken aback by the shift in Marcus's tone. "What?" "I just said." "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "You don't know who I am. And you should. Because if you did, you wouldn't be standing here making jokes like this." The officer hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. He glanced back at his partner, who was starting to look uncomfortable with the situation. Marcus stepped forward, his calm demeanor shifting to one of authority. "I'm the new police chief of Milford," he stated, his eyes locking with the older officers. "And I don't take kindly to people who don't respect my community, or me." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if time had frozen. The officers stood in stunned silence, processing what Marcus had just said. The realization hit them hard. What started as a prank, a joke at his expense, was now spiraling into something they could no longer control. The power dynamics had just shifted. Marcus wasn't the man that the silence between them was thick, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment, the officers just stood there, trying to make sense of what Marcus had just said. The older officer, still wearing that smug grin, looked at his partner as if to say, "Can you believe this?" But Marcus's eyes were locked on him, unwavering, his words still echoing in the tense space between them. The young officer, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "Wait, you're the new chief?" His voice was laced with uncertainty, clearly struggling to wrap his head around the revelation. He glanced down at Marcus's truck, then back up at him, as if trying to reconcile the ordinary-looking mechanic with the idea of him being the town's new police chief. Marcus nodded slowly, his tone now calm but firm. "Yes, I am. And this," he motioned to the scene, "this behavior isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. You're supposed to serve and protect, not harass people for no reason." The words came out measured, but beneath them was an undeniable undercurrent of authority that demanded respect. The older officer, who had been pushing the boundaries of his power, now seemed unsure of how to proceed. His previous confidence had started to crumble, and it was becoming clear that the joke had backfired. The young officer beside him fidgeted nervously, his face flushed with embarrassment. For the first time in a long while, Marcus saw something close to guilt in their eyes, an unfamiliar feeling for these officers, who had no doubt acted with impunity before. We didn't know," the older officer stammered, his arrogance from moments earlier now evaporating. "I mean, we were just messing around, didn't mean anything by it." His words felt hollow, as if he was trying to deflect from the fact that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "We thought you were just some guy. It was just a joke." Marcus took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to snap at them. He could feel his temper rising, but he was trying to control it. He wasn't just any guy. And he wasn't in the mood for excuses. "It's not about a joke," Marcus said, his voice steady now. "It's about respect. You don't get to treat people like that just because you think you can. I don't care who you thought I was, your job is to be professional. To protect everyone equally, no matter what they look like or where they come from. The air between them felt colder now, the tension almost unbearable. The officer who had tried to explain himself shuffled awkwardly, looking down at his boots as if he could somehow disappear into the pavement. Marcus's gaze moved between the two officers, who now seemed much smaller in the face of his quiet fury.
Been unexpected, surprising, even, but it had also triggered something deep within him, something he hadn't realized was there until now. The responsibility of leadership. The sense of duty that came with being the town's new police chief. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to reflect on the life he had lived up until that point, the life he'd built with Jana. He'd always been a quiet man, content with the simplicity of his existence. But that moment in front of the gas station had reminded him that sometimes, life thrusts you into situations you never asked for. Situations that demand more of you than you ever thought you had to give. As he pulled into his shop, the early morning sunlight bathed the familiar old building in a soft glow. The engine sputtered to a stop, and Marcus sat there for a moment, just staring at the brick walls of the garage. This place had always been a refuge for him, a space where he could fix things, build things, make them better. He'd poured years of sweat and labor into this shop. It was his pride, and it had always been his way of serving the community. But now, as the new police chief, the role he had reluctantly stepped into after a long and storied career in the military, the weight of responsibility wasn't something he could escape, not anymore. Jana was sitting at the kitchen table when Marcus walked through the door, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the overhead lights. She looked up from the cup of coffee she was sipping, her expression one of curiosity, tempered with concern. She had always been his rock, the calm in his storm, but even she couldn't hide the fact that something was different about him today. His eyes were tired, yet there was a fire there too, a flicker of something new. She knew that look well. "Hey, you're home early," she said, trying to sound casual. "How's the shop? Everything running smooth?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before responding, knowing he couldn't keep this from her. She had always been the first person he turned to for advice, for support, but this was different. This wasn't just a regular day. "Jana, something happened at the gas station this morning," he began, his voice low, unsure of how to explain it all. "I had a run-in with some of the officers. They didn't know who I was. They treated me like I was just some guy off the street." He stopped for a moment, letting the words sink in before he continued. "I had to set them straight. I told them I was the new police chief." Jana put her coffee cup down, her expression changing instantly. She knew Marcus. She knew he wasn't one to seek attention, let alone cause trouble. But this was different. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "They apologized," Marcus said, though his tone was tinged with disbelief. "But it wasn't just about an apology. It was about power, about how they thought they could treat me like that, because they didn't know who I was. They didn't know I was their boss now." Jana's brow furrowed, but she remained silent for a moment, processing what Marcus had told her. She knew how much he hated conflict, how much he loathed drama, and yet here he was, forced into a position of authority he never asked for, a position that demanded he confront the very people who were supposed to be his colleagues, his team. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Marcus had always been destined for something more than fixing engines. His time in the military had shaped him into a man of strength and conviction, qualities that he had long kept hidden. This new role, despite how it came about, was his time to make a real difference. "You know, Marcus," Jana said finally, her voice softer now, "I think you were meant for this. I don't know how or why, but I think you were meant to change things around here. You've always been the one who does things the right way. This town needs someone like you." Marcus looked at her, the exhaustion in his eyes slowly lifting as her words sank in. She had always been the one to believe in him when he didn't believe in himself. But could he really make a difference? Could he change things? He knew that Milford, for all its quiet charm, had its issues, problems that ran deep, problems that couldn't be solved with a wrench and a pair of pliers. The police force was just the beginning. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that his journey as chief was going to be anything but easy. Maybe, Marcus muttered, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders. But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take a complete overhaul. And I'm not sure the department is ready for that.
Jana reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his. You're ready. I know you are. He nodded slowly, unsure if he was ready to take on the magnitude of what lay ahead. But Jana's belief in him sparked something inside him, a flame that began to grow brighter with every passing moment. She was right. It wasn't just about the small community of Milford, it was about the people. About making sure they felt seen, heard, and respected. This wasn't a job to be taken lightly. Later that day, Marcus walked into the town's small police station for the first time as chief. The building was quiet, save for the low hum of the overhead lights. The scent of stale coffee lingered in the air, and the worn-out furniture suggested that the station had seen better days. He didn't know what he expected, but it certainly wasn't this. It felt more like a relic than a place of justice, a place that had been forgotten in time. Inside, several officers were seated at their desks, most of them engaged in small talk or flipping through paperwork. When Marcus stepped through the door, there was a collective silence. They didn't know what to expect either, not yet. They knew he had been appointed, but they didn't know him. Didn't know his values. Didn't know the kind of chief he would be. Good afternoon, Marcus said, his voice commanding but calm. He didn't raise it, didn't have to. The authority in his tone was enough to make them stop and pay attention. I know some of you have heard about my arrival, but let me make one thing clear, I'm here to serve this town. I'm here to protect every person in this community, no matter their background. If you're not on board with that, now's the time to speak up. The room was still. No one spoke. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Some of them had probably never worked under anyone like Marcus. They had been comfortable, used to doing things their way for years, but Marcus was different. He wasn't going to let this small-town police force stay the way it was, he was going to change it. We'll be having a meeting tomorrow morning, Marcus continued. I expect all of you to be there. We need to talk about what it means to truly protect this community, not just wear a badge and go through the motions. I'll be looking at the way we operate, and I'll expect you all to start respecting this town and its people the way you should have been all along. Understood? The officers nodded, some of them reluctantly, others more willing to follow his lead. For Marcus, it was just the first step in a long journey. But he knew one thing for sure, it was a journey that would change Milford forever. And as much as the following morning, Marcus arrived early at the station, determined to make his presence known, not as a figurehead, but as a leader who was ready to roll up his sleeves and get to work. The building still smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork, but today it felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, a sense of change coming that no one could ignore. As he walked through the front doors, Marcus knew this meeting would set the tone for his leadership. The officers, still unsure of what kind of chief they were dealing with, shuffled nervously in their chairs, unsure whether to sit up straight or slouch. No one spoke at first. Marcus stood at the head of the room, his stance calm but assertive. He knew his job was not just to change the way the department operated, but to challenge the deep-rooted complacency that had taken root in the town's police force. For years, the officers had operated with a kind of quiet arrogance, not really answering to anyone but themselves. That mentality had gone unchecked for too long, and Marcus intended to fix that. He dreaded the responsibility, he knew that, deep down, he was ready for it. The room grew quiet as Marcus surveyed the faces in front of him. He saw a few familiar ones, some of the older officers who had been around for years, and a few newer faces, younger officers who had recently joined the force. He could feel their skepticism, their apprehension about him. They didn't know him. They didn't trust him. And why should they? To them, Marcus was just another outsider, thrust into a role they weren't sure he deserved. They were used to their ways, the old system where power was defined by rank and age, not by integrity or accountability. But Marcus wasn't here to fit into that mold. He took a deep breath and began, his voice steady. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I know the past few days have been interesting. Some of you might be wondering what kind of chief I'm going to be. Some of you might think I don't belong here. He paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the room was almost palpable. But let me make one thing clear, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make sure this department works for the people of Milford. And that means a lot of things are going to change. He noticed a few raised eyebrows at his statement, but no one dared speak up. He pressed on, his tone unwavering. For too long, this town's police force has been disconnected from the people it's supposed to protect. You all know it. I know it. The community knows it. And if we're going to fix that, we need to start with ourselves. One of the older officers shifted in his seat, his hands clasped in front of him. Marcus could tell he was waiting for something, maybe for him to back down or show weakness. But Marcus had no intention of doing either. He had spent years in the military and had seen firsthand how complacency could destroy a team, a unit. If he could survive the chaos of war, he could navigate the storm that awaited him here. I'm not saying this to insult anyone, Marcus continued, but we're going to have to look at some hard truths. We've got to change the way we interact with the community. No more treating people like they're beneath us. No more looking the other way when we see problems brewing. And no more us versus them mentality. We're here to serve, and if you're not prepared to do that, then maybe this job isn't for you. A few of the officers exchanged glances, their discomfort growing. They had never heard a speech like this before. To them, leadership was about control, about holding on to power. They weren't used to hearing about mutual respect or humility. The change Marcus was proposing was radical, and it was clear that some of them didn't know how to take it. I've been in your shoes, Marcus said, his voice softening. I've walked the streets. I know what it's like to feel like you're the one who has to hold it all together. But leadership isn't about being the one who's in charge. It's about being the one who takes responsibility for everything that happens under their watch. He could see a few of the younger officers starting to nod, the message beginning to sink in. It was the older officers, the ones who had been doing things a certain way for decades, who seemed less convinced. But Marcus knew this was going to take time. It wasn't going to happen overnight. Change never did. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, Marcus continued, and it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to challenge the way we've done things. But if we're going to make Milford a safer, better place, we've got to be willing to change. We've got to be willing to put the community first. A long pause followed, the tension in the room almost unbearable. Marcus let the silence linger, knowing that it was exactly what they needed. He wasn't just going to throw out demands. He was going to give them the space to digest what he'd said. He wanted them to come to the realization that the old ways weren't going to cut it anymore. Finally, one of the younger officers spoke up. I get what you're saying, Chief. I mean, it's hard, but I think you're right. Things need to change. The words came slowly, but they were sincere. The officer looked around at the others, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of hope in the room. Change might be possible. But only if they were all willing to make it happen together. Marcus nodded, his voice steady but filled with purpose. Good. That's the first step. We're going to start with the basics. Respect. Integrity. Accountability. Those are the foundations of this department from here on out. If you can't agree with those, now's the time to speak up. There was another long pause, but this time, no one spoke. Marcus could tell that the officers were beginning to understand that he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't here to play games. He wasn't here to be their friend. He was here to make the department better. And whether they liked it or not, they were going to have to follow his lead. By the time the meeting ended, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't immediate, and Marcus didn't expect it to be. But there was a quiet acknowledgement that things were about to change. The officers filed out of the room, some of them still unsure, but most of them looking at Marcus with newfound respect. They weren't entirely on board yet, but the seed had been planted. And sometimes, that's all it took, just a little crack in the armor. As Marcus sat in his office afterward, he couldn't help but reflect on the morning's events. He knew the road ahead would be full of challenges. There would be pushback, resistance, and moments where he would question whether he was doing the right thing. But for the first time since taking on the role of chief, Marcus felt a sense of purpose. He was doing what he was meant to do, and he knew it wasn't just about leading the department, it was about leading the town toward a better future. The journey had only just begun. But with each step, Marcus was more convinced that he was exactly where he needed to be. Milford had its problems, but under his leadership, it would change. And nothing, not even the most entrenched of habits the next few weeks were a whirlwind for Marcus. He had barely had a moment to breathe, but every day brought something new, a challenge, a breakthrough, a setback, or a surprising show of support. But through it all, he stuck to his principles. He wasn't going to let the pressure break him. He wasn't going to give in to the toxic habits that had festered within the department for so long. The officers had started to show signs of change, some more readily than others, but he could tell it wasn't going to be a smooth transition. Marcus knew that for the department to change, he had to make some hard decisions, the kinds of decisions that would alienate him from some of his officers. He had to be firm, decisive, and unflinching. He couldn't afford to show weakness. His leadership would be defined by how he handled the moments when things weren't easy, when the temptation to fall back into the old ways seemed like the simplest path. One afternoon, Marcus found himself standing in front of the station again, staring at the faded parking lot lines, watching as a few of the younger officers milled around outside, chatting and laughing. It was a warm day, the sun beating down, but there was a heaviness in the air. Something was off, and he could feel it in his gut. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but his instincts told him there was trouble brewing just beneath the surface. He walked into the station, intent on finding out what was really going on. When he entered the break room, he saw Officer Thompson and Officer Hayes, two of the department's more senior officers, whispering to one another in the corner. Their faces didn't register the usual camaraderie they once shared. Instead, they were tight-lipped, eyes darting around like they were plotting something behind closed doors. "Is everything okay, gentlemen?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but full of purpose. He could feel the tension between them, the subtle unease, and it didn't sit right with him. Both officers looked up, startled, as if they hadn't expected Marcus to walk in on their conversation. Hayes quickly cleared his throat, and Thompson gave a nervous smile. "Yeah, Chief. Everything's fine," Thompson replied, though his words lacked conviction. It was clear to Marcus that something was being hidden. Marcus didn't push it right away. He knew that sometimes the best way to get to the truth was to give people the space to come forward on their own. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was a significant issue brewing just under the surface, something more than just a simple misunderstanding. That evening, after his shift ended, Marcus received a call from one of the local shop owners, a man named Mr. Patel, who ran the convenience store just down the street from the station. His voice trembled as he explained what had happened earlier that day, would stand in his way. "Chief, I don't know what to do," Mr. Patel said, his tone filled with anxiety. "A few of your officers came by this afternoon, and they were demanding free goods, acting like they owned the place. When I refused, they threatened to come back and make my life difficult." Marcus was taken aback. The officers he had been working with for weeks, officers he thought were starting to embrace his vision, were now apparently taking advantage of the very people they were supposed to protect. His stomach churned at the thought. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid. This was the kind of behavior that had led to the community's distrust of the police in the first place. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Patel. I'll personally take care of this." "Thank you for bringing it to my attention," Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of fury. He didn't waste any time. He knew he had to act fast before this situation got out of hand. Marcus made his way to the station to confront the officers involved. He wasn't sure who was responsible yet, but he had a hunch that Thompson and Hayes were at the heart of it. Their behavior the day before had seemed off, and now this incident with Patel only confirmed his suspicions. When he arrived, Marcus found the officers in the briefing room, casually chatting as if nothing had happened. The atmosphere in the room was unnervingly light, given the gravity of the situation. He didn't give them time to prepare. He walked straight in and shut the door behind him with a firm click. "I just spoke with Mr. Patel," Marcus began, his voice low but full of authority. "He told me that two of you, Thompson, Hayes, came into his store today and tried to extort him for free goods. Is that true?" His gaze moved from Thompson to Hayes, who both stiffened under his stare. There was a long pause before Thompson spoke, but his words were defensive, almost dismissive. "That's not exactly what happened, Chief. We just stopped by for some coffee, and Mr. Patel was being difficult. We didn't ask for anything extra." Marcus didn't let him finish. "Don't lie to me. I've already spoken to Mr. Patel. He said you threatened him." His voice didn't raise, but the room seemed to shrink under his gaze. "I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my department. Not under any circumstances. You are here to serve and protect, not to intimidate or bully the very people who pay your salaries." Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly trying to avoid eye contact. Thompson seemed to be the more vocal of the two, but even he couldn't meet Marcus's gaze now. "We didn't mean anything by it," Thompson muttered, almost too quietly for Marcus to hear. "We were just messing around." "Messing around?" Marcus repeated, his voice colder now. "You think extortion is a joke? That you can get away with this just because you wear a badge?" His hands clenched at his sides, trying to maintain control of the anger rising within him. "You're lucky I'm giving you the chance to explain yourselves. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. If you don't think you can follow the rules, if you don't think you can treat people with respect, then maybe you need to reconsider your place on this force." The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the muffled hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus could see that the officers knew the gravity of the situation now. There was no escaping it. They had crossed a line, and there was no excuse for it. After a long, tense moment, Hayes spoke up, his voice shaky. "Chief, we messed up. We were wrong. We got carried away. We're sorry. It won't happen again." Marcus nodded, but his eyes didn't soften. "I hope not. You've both been here long enough to know better. You're not rookies. I expect more from you. I'll be speaking with the department about this, and I'll make it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. If there's another incident like this, there will be consequences." As Marcus left the briefing room, he could feel the weight of the decision hanging over him. It was hard to believe that the officers he had been working with so closely were capable of such actions. But he knew one thing for sure: this moment had reaffirmed his commitment to making Milford's police force something different. It wasn't just about correcting individual mistakes, it was about changing the culture. And that was going to take time, effort, and sacrifice. But if Marcus had learned anything in his years of service, it was that change was possible. And he would make sure that Milford's police department would reflect the values it should have always upheld: integrity, respect, and accountability. Later that evening, as Marcus sat down to dinner with Jana, he couldn't shake the events of the day from his mind. The betrayal of trust, the disappointment in his officers, it all felt like too much to bear. But as Jana looked at him, offering a quiet smile, he knew one thing: this was the path he was meant to walk. This wasn't about easy wins or shortcuts. It was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was. And even though he didn't have all the answers, he was determined to lead Milford into a better future. One decision. The weeks that followed were nothing short of transformative for Marcus, both personally and professionally. The department was in turmoil, but there was an undeniable energy, a sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew the rules of the game were changing. Some officers embraced the shift with open arms, eager to prove they were part of the solution. Others dug in their heels, resisting change at every turn. But Marcus had anticipated this. He knew that progress often met with friction. Still, he remained steadfast, committed to his vision of a more accountable, transparent, and community-focused police force. The incident with Thompson and Hayes had sent ripples through the department. Rumors spread quickly, and whispers filled the halls about Marcus's leadership style. Some officers thought he was too harsh, too quick to punish those who fell short of his expectations. But what they didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't punishing them for mistakes, he was holding them accountable for their actions. There was a distinct difference, and it was a line he was willing to draw in the sand. Despite the tension within the ranks, Marcus knew that his message was slowly starting to take hold. It wasn't easy, but he was seeing small victories each day. Officers who once sneered at the notion of community policing were now volunteering to attend neighborhood meetings. Patrols were becoming more involved in local events, engaging with residents in ways that hadn't happened in years. But there was still work to be done. The department's ingrained culture of entitlement and insensitivity didn't disappear overnight, and Marcus was about to face his toughest challenge yet. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office reviewing reports, he received a call that would change the course of his leadership. It was from the mayor, a man named Nathaniel Blackwood, who had been in office for as long as anyone could remember. The mayor was known for his political savvy, but his reputation for dealing with sensitive issues was less than stellar. He had often turned a blind eye to the misconduct that had run rampant in Milford's police force, and Marcus knew that their relationship had been strained from the beginning. "Chief Marshal," Mayor Blackwood's voice crackled through the phone, "I need to speak with you about the direction you're taking the department. We've been getting complaints, rumors from some of your officers, and I think it's time we had a conversation about the future of Milford's law enforcement." Marcus's stomach tightened. He'd been expecting something like this. The mayor's office had been noticeably silent since Marcus's appointment, but he had no illusions that Blackwood had been watching every move he made. The mayor had the power to control the narrative, to shape the public's opinion, and Marcus was all too aware that he could easily become a target in the political crossfire. "I'm listening, Mayor Blackwood," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's on your mind?" "We've been hearing reports that your approach is too aggressive. Too divisive," the mayor continued, his tone cold and methodical. "People are starting to question whether your leadership is really what this department needs. Some of the town council members are even suggesting a re-evaluation of your position." Marcus's jaw clenched. He had anticipated that his reforms might not be universally embraced, but to hear it from the mayor himself felt like a slap in the face. He had worked tirelessly to steer the department away from the dark days of favoritism and corruption, and now, it seemed, his efforts were being painted as a threat to the status quo. Time. "I'm not here to make friends, Mayor," Marcus said, his voice firm, though the weight of the conversation hung heavily in the air. "I'm here to make this department a reflection of the values the people of Milford deserve. If that's too much for some people to handle, then so be it. But I will not back down." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Marcus could almost hear the mayor weighing his options, considering how best to respond. Finally, Blackwood spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "I understand your passion, Chief. But you need to remember something: this town is built on relationships. Power is not just about enforcement, it's about influence. And right now, you're making enemies. You're pushing people away, and you're doing it in the name of righteousness. But righteousness doesn't always win, Marcus. Not in the world of politics. Marcus's mind raced as he processed the mayor's words. This was the same kind of thinking that had allowed corruption to flourish for years. The idea that maintaining power at any cost was more important than doing what was right. It was a mentality that had kept Milford in the grip of its own stagnation, and Marcus refused to be complicit in it. "I'm not here to play politics, Mayor," Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "I'm here to clean up a mess that you and others have allowed to fester for far too long. If that means making some powerful people uncomfortable, then so be it. I'm not backing down. I'm not going to let this town's future be decided by the whims of those who are more concerned about protecting their own interests than doing what's right for the people." The mayor didn't respond immediately. For a moment, Marcus thought the conversation had ended, but then Blackwood spoke again, his tone tinged with resignation. "Fine. Do it your way. But remember, Chief, the people in power are not easily swayed. And they don't forget. Watch your back." Marcus hung up the phone, his heart pounding. He had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in Milford. But in that moment, he knew that it was the right thing to do. He wasn't in this for the popularity or the political maneuvering. He was in this to make a real difference, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, Marcus felt the weight of the mayor's warning looming over him. He could sense the tension building in the air, not just within the department but in the town itself. The rumor mill was churning, and whispers of discontent spread like wildfire. People who had once supported his reforms now began to question his methods, asking whether his aggressive tactics were alienating the very people he was trying to protect. The media, too, began to turn on him, with headlines suggesting that Marcus was losing control of his own department. It was a dangerous game, and Marcus knew that his every move was being scrutinized. But despite the pressure, he stood firm. His commitment to changing Milford's police force was unwavering. He continued to push forward with his reform agenda, bringing in new training programs, launching community outreach initiatives, and holding officers accountable for their actions. Each day was a battle, but Marcus knew that the fight was worth it. Then, a breakthrough came. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, but it was the kind of change that mattered most. One morning, Marcus received a letter from a local resident, a woman named Eleanor Smith, whose son had been involved in a run-in with the police a few months prior. She had written to thank him, not just for the reforms he was implementing but for the simple act of listening. She explained that her son had been treated with respect during a recent encounter with officers, and that small act had meant the world to her. It was a quiet victory, but to Marcus, it was a sign that his work was starting to have the impact he had hoped for. As he sat down to read the letter, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long, and the challenges were far from over. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of hope. He had made a real difference in one person's life, and that was all that mattered. The town of Milford wasn't going to change overnight. The political forces aligned against him weren't going to give up easily. But Marcus was prepared to face whatever came next. He had taken on this role to make the hard decisions, to confront the ugliness that others were too afraid to address. And no matter how difficult it got, Marcus would keep moving forward. One step at a time. One decision at a time. The transformation had already begun, and there was no turning back.